All right, so we're diving into some pretty controversial territory today.
Yeah.
Buckle up because we're going to be tackling the recent situation with UFC fighter Bryce Mitchell.
Yeah. It's been all over the news.
Oh yeah, and it's one of those things where um, it's going to be a tough conversation,
Right.
but I think it's important that we kind of understand the different perspectives and what's at stake here.
For sure. Yeah.
So we're going to be basing our deep dive today on excerpts from a source titled Pasted Text. And basically the core issue is that Mitchell made some anti-Semitic and homophobic comments on a podcast.
Yeah. A podcast appearance that went very wrong very quickly.
Yeah, and it sparked a lot of backlash, obviously.
Right.
And so the question that we want to explore today is really how is Mitchell, how's the public, and how is the UFC itself responding to this whole situation?
Yeah, because it really has kind of spiraled in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So let's maybe start by actually detailing what Mitchell said, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important to kind of not shy away from the specifics here.
Absolutely. You have to really lay it out there to understand the gravity of what happened.
Right, exactly. So I mean, he was on this podcast, and he started praising Hitler.
Which already right there is incredibly shocking.
Yeah, and then went on to actually deny the Holocaust.
Yeah, which, again, I mean, just a complete disregard for historical facts and the suffering of millions of people.
And then on top of that, he also made some homophobic remarks as well.
Yeah, so it was this kind of, trifecta of really hateful rhetoric.
Right, and I think, and to understand kind of the fallout, we also have to look at how Mitchell himself responded, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the immediate aftermath of something like this is always revealing.
Yeah, and he actually posted an apology on Instagram.
Okay, so he did address it publicly.
He did. And I actually have the text of it here, so let me just read it verbatim.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I'm sorry I sounded insensitive. I definitely was not trying to offend anybody, but I know I did. I know that a lot of people died in the Holocaust, and that's a fact. Hitler did a lot of evil things. I think we can all agree on that. I'm definitely not a Nazi, and definitely do not condone any of the evil things Hitler did.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, first of all, I'm struck by the fact that he keeps saying sounded insensitive. Like, it's more about how it was perceived than actually taking responsibility for the words themselves.
Right. It's like he's more worried about the PR fallout than actually acknowledging the harm that he caused.
Exactly. And then there's that line, a lot of people died in the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's such an understatement, right? It almost feels dismissive.
It is. I mean, we're talking about the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews. This wasn't just some random tragic event. It was a carefully planned genocide. And to minimize it in any way is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, right? I mean,
Yeah.
to understand the real impact of Mitchell's words, we have to remember the Holocaust wasn't just this, historical event that happened in the past. I mean, it has lasting scars on the world, right?
Yeah. It continues to shape our understanding of hate, prejudice, and the very real dangers of these kinds of ideologies. And it's not just about remembering the past either.
Right.
I mean, minimizing or denying the Holocaust actually fuels these harmful ideas in the present.
Yeah, I mean, following this story, I kept thinking, like, how can anyone deny the reality of something like the Holocaust?
Well, it's a complex issue, and I don't think there's any easy answer.
Right.
But a lot of times, it stems from this kind of mix of misinformation, prejudice, and this desire to rewrite history to fit a certain narrative,
It's almost like they're trying to create their own version of reality.
Exactly. And it's becoming more and more common, unfortunately, especially with the rise of online echo chambers and, these spaces where these kind of harmful ideas can just fester and spread unchecked.
Right, yeah. And so, we've talked about Mitchell's comments, we've talked about his apology, but what about the UFC itself? I mean, how did they respond to all of this?
Well, Dana White, who's the president of the UFC, he did call the comments dumb and ignorant.
Okay.
But ultimately, the organization decided not to punish Mitchell.
Wow.
They cited freedom of expression as their reason.
I mean, I understand the principle of free speech, right? But shouldn't there be some limits when it comes to hate speech?
That's the big question, right? Where do we draw the line?
Especially when it's coming from someone with such a huge platform like Mitchell. I mean, he has so many fans. He's such a a public figure.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this situation so tricky. Because on the one hand, you have this fundamental right to freedom of speech.
Right.
But on the other hand, that right is not absolute. You can't just yell fire in a crowded theater.
Right.
And a lot of people would argue that inciting hatred and discrimination, especially against vulnerable groups, that goes beyond protected speech.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong argument.
And it should have consequences.
Right, and especially when you consider the UFC's audience, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they have such a huge global reach.
Millions of fans around the world.
Yeah, and a lot of them are young, impressionable people.
Right.
So what kind of message does it send when the UFC seemingly condones this kind of behavior?
Exactly. And it's not just about the message they're sending to their fans.
Right.
I mean, it's also about the responsibility that they have as an organization.
Mm-hmm.
They're in a position of power and influence, and they have to consider the impact of their actions, especially in a situation like this.
Right, and I know, like, some of their sports leagues, they've taken a much more proactive approach, right?
Absolutely. You're seeing mandatory sensitivity training, partnerships with anti-hate organizations. I mean, there are steps that can be taken to foster a more responsible and inclusive environment.
Yeah, and it just makes you wonder, right? I mean, is the UFC prioritizing their image over actually taking a stand against hate speech?
It's a valid question. I mean, their decision not to punish Mitchell essentially sends the message that this kind of rhetoric is something we just have to accept.
Right.
And I think the question we all have to ask ourselves is, do we accept it?
And at what cost?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and then just to add another layer to all of this, Mitchell did end his apology by saying that he'll be more considerate in the future.
Right, which, of course, is what you would hope for. But
yeah.
it does make you wonder, is this a genuine commitment to personal growth, or is it just damage control?
Right. Is he actually going to take the time to educate himself to understand the impact of his words?
Only time will tell.
Yeah. So, wow. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. What are some key takeaways that you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think this situation really highlights how complex these issues are.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about freedom of speech, the impact of hateful rhetoric, the responsibility of individuals and organizations.
It's not just a black and white issue.
No, absolutely not. And there are no easy answers. But what we can do is engage in these tough conversations.
Right.
We need to educate ourselves and others. And we need to hold individuals and institutions accountable for their actions. We can't just let this kind of stuff slide.
Yeah, because ignoring these issues won't make them go away.
Exactly. And in fact, they'll probably just get worse.
Right. So I guess, to leave our listeners with something to think about, what do you think, how do you believe organizations like the UFC should handle situations like this in the future?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to, what kind of world do we want to create? Do we want a world where hate speech is tolerated? Or do we want a world where we actively challenge these harmful ideas and promote empathy and understanding?
Yeah.
And I think organizations like the UFC, they have a huge role to play in shaping that world.
Absolutely.
So what role do they want to play?
That's the question.
That's the question.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this deep dive. It's been really insightful.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And to our listeners, keep thinking about these issues. Keep the conversation going. And let's work together to create a more just and compassionate world.